Hello and welcome back to the latest in my series of camera basics. If you haven't seen one of these before, this is where we talk about the basics of camera operation in landscape photography. We do this out in the field, not sat in an office talking about photos, but out there showing you the difference in the settings and the different changes make in real life. Today we're going to be talking about filters. We'll go through which filters you need, which filters you don't need, what to buy, what filter sets you should look at, all of that sort of thing, everything you need to know about filters. So let's kick off with what I think is the most important filter, one that practically lives on my camera, which is the Circular Polarizer. Okay, so what the Circular Polarizer does is it basically cuts off the glare and reflections off your surfaces. So in landscapes it's very important for water. In other types of photography you can use it to cut the reflections off of glass, for example. And what that will let you do is it will almost let you see through the water or the glass and see what's beneath, which is really useful if you're in, say, a lake or a pond and you want to see some rocks beneath the waterline. So as you can see, when I turn the polarizer, we go from having a really white reflection of the sky, which today is really cloudy, to being a more sort of murky grey colour as we start to see the colours in the water. That's because the polarizer is taking off some of the reflections and changing that colour from white to what the watercolour actually is. The other thing it's really useful for is if you're in woodland and it's been raining or everything's damp, then it will cut through all the sort of glare on the leaves and the reflections that are coming off of those. So instead of getting that sort of sheen, you'll then really bring out the colours, which can also have an effect on the sky and really bring out the colours in the sky as well. So that's why Circular Polarizer almost always lives on my lens. I always give it a quick spin, see what it looks like with a bit of polarization and see whether it's worth it. If not, I'll pop it off and take the photo without it, but I always like to try it first because I find it can often just bring out colours and make your photos just take them to the next level without a lot of effort. Let's take a few example shots and I'll show you what we get. So that first image there is pretty much with the polarizer on maximum settings. I can see the full colour of the water, which today is this sort of browny, murky colour. And then when I spin the dial, we can see now the water has gone that sort of reflection, that's got white colour, reflecting the colour of the sky, the clouds. Very different image, shall we say. Now, the other main reason that Circular Polarizer almost lives on my lens is because it's one of the few things that you can't really replicate in post. You can't very easily take those reflections out after you've taken the image. It's got to be done when you're taking it. Make sure you get it in camera. So that's one of the reasons I really like this filter. A few downsides with it. One, it does reduce a bit of the light hitting your sensor, so you will need a slightly longer exposure, not by a lot, just a little bit. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, up to you. And of course, if you've got a cheaper filter, and this will be the same for all of the filters we discussed today, it could reduce the image quality, because obviously the glass in a filter is probably not as good as the glass in your really expensive lens. Okay, so the next filters that I think are absolutely crucial, especially if you're doing any work around water, waterfalls, seascapes, that sort of thing, are ND filters. These basically reduce the amount of light hitting your sensor, which means you can take a longer exposure in the daytime without it being overexposed. Now, you can do this in camera with a few different ways, by either closing down the aperture or maybe reducing the ISO, but they're fairly limited in what you can do. And if you want to get, say, 30-second exposures, then you're definitely going to need some of these if you want to take them in the middle of the day. Now, the best way to use these is to set your shot up first, compose it, focus it, camera into manual focus, and then pop your filter on. The reason for this is once you put your filter on and you've reduced the light coming into your camera, it's going to be very difficult to get an accurate focus and composition. So you want to do that all before you put the filter on. This is easier with mirrorless cameras because they do a better job with low light, but with DSLR it's incredibly important because you won't really see anything, especially if you're using the viewfinder, once you put the filter on. Now, in terms of timings, there are apps you can use which were really useful when I was getting started. And you put in your shutter speed as it normally would be without the filter, you tell it what filter you're using, and then it will give you what time you need to get the same shot and the right exposure. Now, these are really useful when I started, and I still find them quite useful today, but now I tend to just experiment a bit with them, because you can, with the long exposures, either be very deliberate with your timing and get the right amount of blur in your subject, or I quite like to just experiment, especially if you've got movement in clouds, just try a 30 seconds to 60 seconds, you know, depending on what your goal is for the photo, really. These ND filters come in various strengths, everything up from a 3-stop, which reduces the amount of light getting in by 3 stops, up to I think 10 or 15 stops, depending on how long you want your exposure to be. Today, the sea's not too rough, so I'm going with this 6-stop here, which will reduce my shutter speed down from, let's have a quick look, 1/3 of a second, and we're going to go to something in the 30-second range. So we've got a camera set up at 1/3 of a second, f8, and we've got everything focused, composition done. We pop the filter on, adjust our camera, and we're just going to try a 30-second and see how it comes out. Good tip for this is use your 2-second timer on the camera. That will basically give you 2 seconds from the moment you hit the shutter speed and stop any unintentional movement from hitting that shutter button when you take your photo. So as you can see from those two shots, I'll put them up now. The first one here, we've got the shot with very clear defined waves. And you can see the waves and all the detail in the water, which may not be what you want. Today it's very cloudy, the weather's not great, we're going for that sort of fine arty look. And if I put the second image up, you'll see that you've got the water perfectly smooth, nice ethereal look, which is what I particularly love from seascape photography. So this also works with waterfalls. You get a bit of movement in the water as it comes down. You know, depending on how long you want your exposure to be, you might need a 3-stop or even possibly less than that. Now, this is also an effect that's quite difficult to replicate in post. You can do it, you can take lots of quick images and then ask Photoshop to sort of blur them all together. It's a bit of hard work, and personally, I'd go with the filters. I think they're a better way of doing things. Okay, so those are the two filters that I think you really do need when you start out with landscape photography, especially if you're around water, seascapes, that sort of thing. Now, there are a couple of other filters that I see promoted quite often that I really don't think you need, especially when you're beginning. The first of those is a UV filter. Modern cameras don't really need a UV filter anymore, to be honest. There are a few edge cases, potentially if you're trying to photograph the eclipse and you've got a really long lens on and you're sort of zooming in on the sun, then maybe that's a point where you might need to get yourself one, or certainly some different gear, in which case I'd look up some details on how to do that, because that's a bit more specialist than what we're going into today. But when you're beginning, don't bother with it. The main reason people buy them these days is to protect the front element of their lens in case their camera, you know, if they knock their camera or something, then they're only smashing a cheap filter instead of the front element. But if I was doing this personally, I'd either go with the Circular Polarizer, because that at least has some use, or I'd go with a lens hood. Just screw on a lens hood, and if you've managed to drop your camera and it's landed and a rock has gone through that lens hood and broken that, then the chances are your little UV filter wouldn't do anything anyway. It'd still be smashing your lens to pieces. So what's the point at the end of the day? I don't really see the benefit. You've bought a really nice expensive lens, which is why you want to protect it, and then you go and put a relatively cheap piece of glass on the front, which is obviously going to have some impact on your image quality. So for me, I wouldn't bother with that. The second one that I see a lot of people purchase and maybe isn't needed when you start out, but you could argue you might want to get into later, is a graduated ND filter. Now, this is a filter where it's very dark at the top or at one end of the filter, and then it gradually gets lighter towards the bottom. So if you've got a very bright sky, then you can put the filter in. It will reduce the amount of light coming in from the sky into your image, but leave the subject, the rest of the scene, coming in as it normally would. So it means you can get a perfect exposure all in camera without doing it in post. Now, the reason I don't think these are really needed is because when you do it in post, you could argue you get better results. You know, with technologies like Sky Select, you can select exactly the sky rather than having to have a sort of line going across your image. So if you've got mountains or if you've got trees and things in it that you don't want dark, you can deal with that in post, and it's very easy to do in post. It's not difficult, you know, any tool like Lightroom, that sort of thing, Photoshop, very easily select the sky and you can then reduce the exposure, job done. So you could argue you want to get into that later on. If you find yourself wanting to get the image perfect in camera and do less work in post, then fair enough, go and get yourself a kit of graduated NDs, but I don't think it's something to buy when you're just starting out. So that's the different types of filters that we've covered and how to use them. Now let's talk about which sort of filter system you should get or what you should look at getting. The three main types as I see it, you've got the basic screw-on type, like this Hoya set, which is what I started out with. Basically the way this works is you buy the filter that matches your lens filter ring, and then you just screw it in, and it's a bit fiddly but nothing too disastrous, and away you go. And that's Circular Polarizer switched on and you're off. Very easy, relatively cheap, these things. The downside with them is you either need to get the size that fits your lens, so this is a 67mm lens and then 67mm filters. If you get an upgraded lens that has a different size filter thread, then you're going to need new filters. I've done that many times and it's not a very nice feeling to have to buy a new lens and then go and spend another £100 on a new kit of filters. However, it is quite good in that you can use then a lens hood with your filter because the filter size matches your lens diameter. So that's quite nice if you like shooting with a lens hood. The alternative is you buy the largest possible filter size that you'll think you'll need, say an 82mm, 95mm, and then you can get step-up rings. So that will take this 67mm lens and turn it into a 95mm filter size. Downside with that is you can't lose your lens hood anymore, so that is a trade-off, but it would mean that if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, you can stack, because with a wide-angle lens, if you've got the same filter size, by the time you've got more than a few filters on, you're starting to get vignetting in the corners. So disadvantages, advantages to both. I went with the buy the right size and then regretted it later on when I bought new lenses and had to go and buy a new set. The other options are you can get a magnetic set. Now this was the route I went down to when I bought my new camera and lenses. Basically the way this works is you get a little magnetic ring, you screw that onto your lens. Again, same advantages or disadvantages as the screw-in type, whether you go with the larger size and the step-up rings or get the same sizes and then get your filters changed. But the main benefit with this is that when you're using the NDs, you really want to be taking them on and off quite frequently, because you want to compose without the filter on, focus it without the filter on. Then you put maybe you've got your circular polarizer on as well. You'd set that up, get that all in place, and then you'd screw in your ND, find you've knocked your circular polarizer slightly, and then you had to take it all off again, start again, recompose, reset up your circular polarizer, and then yeah, it just became a bit of a pain. Whereas with the magnetic filters, all you do, pop them on, and away you go. If I need to recompose or refocus, pop it off, and there's no knocking your circular polarizer out of polarization. It's all very easy and very nice and simple. I like simple, makes it nice and quick and easy to photograph with. The final option is probably the most expensive option and not one that I've yet bought, to be honest, which is the full-on filter set. Now these are normally from the higher end brands, and you'll get basically a filter holder that you'll screw into your lens, and then you'll get sheets of glass which have your filters on that you slot in front of your lens. Now the filter systems are very good, I'm sure. They generally come from the better known brands, they're generally more expensive, and you put your filter onto your lens and then you slide in your glass filters. Now the downside with this is it means you need to buy their particular filters that fit in the holder once you've got the set. So if you're wanting new filters, you're stuck with their prices, whatever they may be. The other downside with them is you obviously can't use your lens hood unless you get a filter system that also has a built-in lens hood, but they're a bit more few and far between, shall we say. Now I will touch very briefly on the different brands you can get. I've only got experience with two, so I'm not going to go too in depth into this. I'm sure the Lee or the Nissi or the Kokin filters are particularly good and worth the money, but at the end of the day they're quite expensive, and if you're just starting out and you go and buy a set of filters that are a few £100 that fit your kit lens, and then in 6 months time you go and buy a nice new lens, suddenly you need a different size filter, that's going to be a real pain, and you're not going to like swallowing another 500 quid for brand new filters, for example. So personally, if you're just starting out, I would go with a cheaper brand. I went with these Hoya filters. I find them very good. They're very well rated. I really like the image quality with them, and they're screw-in type, and I had to buy a new set when I bought the new lens. But because they were sort of 50 odd pounds each, it wasn't the end of the world. Unfortunately, when I bought the new camera, I really wanted the magnetic system for all the advantages that I've mentioned earlier, and I couldn't find a Hoya magnetic system. So I went with these K&F filters. Not sponsored, it's probably one of the few videos that isn't sponsored by K&F, but I think they're very good. I don't think the image quality is quite as good as the Hoya, so I do still have the Hoya Circular Polarizer, which if I'm taking what I think will be an amazing image, I'll sometimes spend the extra effort to put that on rather than using the K&F. But for the most of the time, the magnetic system of the K&F is so easy, so much nicer to work with. Improves your workflow no end, so I'd highly recommend the magnetic system. It doesn't have to be K&F, I have no affiliation with them. If you go and buy someone else's, it doesn't bother me. Okay, so I think that just about covers everything I know about the filters and what you want for landscape photography. If I've missed anything, drop a comment below so we can all learn together. Be helpful for me as well, I'm sure. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've liked it. If you have, give it a quick like and let YouTube know that you've enjoyed it, and it'll show it to more people who might also learn something from it. If you want to see some other content, consider subscribing. I've got a few other videos like this going over aperture, focal length, shutter speed, that sort of thing, that you might also find useful. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.